everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and let's try dyeing some yarn with black beans. Like a lot of my supermarket yarn dyeing adventures, I am going to see how much color we can get out of these black beans on their own without any mordants. I know that if you were to pre-treat your wool fibers or cotton fibers with a mordant, you could intensify and amp up the volume of the color, but I sort of want to set a baseline so that way this summer, once we do start playing a lot more with mordants, then we can look back and say, wow, this made a really big difference. Additionally, by not using mordants, everything that I'm using today is kitchen safe, which also means that it can be a fun experiment to do along with kids. I have 2 pounds of dry black beans and 100 grams of Knit Picks Wool of the Andes worsted weight yarn. This is 100% wool, non-superwash. But I don't want to just test this fiber type. I also want to look at our 6 little mini skeins where we have superwash wool, a superwash wool nylon blend, 100% cotton, 100% acrylic, and 100% polyester. While there are many, many more fiber types that exist out there, I like to throw these 6 in a pot as a baseline because sometimes things surprise me a little bit and we see the synthetics actually take up a little color. And in other times, the cotton does better than the wool. So before you poo-poo or naysay a technique, it could be worth trying it on a different type of yarn base before you give up. However, the first thing we have to do now is we have to go and try to extract some color from these beans. When I set out to do this video, there was one thing I did not consider, and that is time. Turns out that you prep the beans and extract the color cold. You learn something new every day. But anyway, I'm starting off with 2 pounds of black beans. And when they start soaking up water, my container might be a little small. There are a lot of tips out there, like don't stir the beans too much until about an hour before you're going to use them. I don't know. There's a lot of information out there. But the one thing that seems to be common is you start off, and I think I added just about 2 cups of water right now. And you're going to want to keep adding more and more water as these beans start to soak it up, which they will. And we're going to keep adding more water. I think that the limit might be 8 cups, or at least the size of this large Tupperware container. And yeah, we're gonna wait, and we're gonna wait 2 days to see what kind of color we extract from these beans. Now, I do have one question about using mordants, and this is something that actually confuses me. So I was taught that you should do your mordanting outside. You need to make sure you use dedicated dye equipment because, you know, it isn't food safe. However, you can get food grade alum, and people use that and cream of tartar as a mordant. And so those are both sold in the spice section and are used, the food grade alum's used for pickling and some other cooking processes. So if it's food grade, can it be used with food safe equipment? I honestly don't really know. I mean, I don't know if the recommendation is to do the mordant outside in a dye safe pot, because if you buy, maybe the commercial alum you can buy for dyeing is cheaper and has impurities in it and therefore is not food safe. Certainly there are other mordants that just are not safe to be anywhere around consumption. But I also don't know if maybe the quantities you use are way more than what you would get at a grocery store. So if you have some information about this, please let me know in the comments, especially if you have any resources to recommend. Anyway, I know that if we were to use mordants, we can expect to get a really brilliant blue from this technique. And actually it might also be pH sensitive, and with changing the pH you could also shift it to a green. I will take a look at the color that we extract and try adding some acid and base to it to see about shifting the color. Even if I'm not going to test all of the different shades we could create in the liquid right now. Either way, I am really curious to see how much color we get from these beans, if we get color with no mordant, and yeah, if you've done this before, again, let me know in the comments. It's been 2 days and there is a lot of color in here. In fact, check out this paper towel that I've been using to wipe my hands and spoon after stirring. So let's go strain out the beans and attempt to dye our yarn. I pre-soaked all of the yarn in some plain tap water for a couple of hours. Some of the tutorials said that you didn't want to stir it an hour before you were about to use the liquid, and I'm honestly not sure what that is about, but I'm pouring the beans sort of into a little sieve so that way I can collect the liquid but then remove the beans from the dye pot. I think I got most of the liquid in there now. Now we can lift it up. There is about 6 cups of liquid here, and I'm going to add it all to our pot. And now we're going to add our yarn and start heating it up. There is nothing in the pot right now except for water and our black bean extract. I am honestly not sure without mordant and vinegar if anything is really going to happen here. But I figured let's try and see what happens here. Give this some time, sort of with some heat. Maybe we'll need to add some more water, but we'll give this some time, and then depending on what happens with vinegar outside of this dye pot, maybe then we'll go ahead and decide to add some. I do think that we will eventually want to add a little more water, but yeah, I think I do want to add a little more water. Okay, I'm adding 4 cups of tap water, and you can see from me pouring it on that, you know, the color that we saw right away is just being soaked from the liquid, but is not the yarn taking color immediately or something like that. Some people will actually do this and let it stay at room temperature. So I'm not sure if I'm making an error by heating it, but I sort of wanted to give it a shot. I plan to leave this in the pot after the heating at least overnight to give a lot of time to see if we get anything without using any mordants or anything like that. But fingers crossed that we're able to see something happen. But you know, if we lift it up, you can see like that color drain away. So we'll be looking for seeing something that doesn't just look off-white happening there. But anyway, I will check back in about half an hour. In each of these cups, I have some diluted bean extract. I took 1/3 of a cup of the extract, added 2/3 a cup of plain water, and then added 1/3 of a cup of that dilution to each of these 2 cups. That is a mouthful. Let's see what happens if we try adding a little bit of vinegar to one of them. This is a 1/2 teaspoon of vinegar, and whoa, do you see that? The color shifted from the black to more of a red. Now, a lot of times with these black beans, you can get some really, really cool blue colors, even though it's looking pretty brownish right now. Again, no mordants, and mordants and having these metal ions around to help the dyes bind to the fiber can shift the color. but I heard that, maybe I read somewhere that adding acid can give you more of a green, but you know, the liquid right now is at least looking a little more pink. I brought over a 1/3 cup, and let's just try adding some baking soda here and see what, if anything, happens to the color. So by adding baking soda, we are making the solution more basic. And it did shift the color a bit. If you notice, the middle one looks sort of purpley. We now have this red, and this one is looking a bit more blue. Now, when I played around with pH with the red cabbage, we did see that we got some cool color changes. And in the wool, some of these stuck behind, but in some of the cottons and other things, we saw when we were rinsing the water and therefore changing the pH of the fabric, that did sort of alter the colors that we were seeing. But I'm gonna go ahead and stick some paper towels in these 3 mixtures and we'll see what we see. The middle swatch is looking a little unremarkable, so I wanted to bring over the paper towel from when I was mixing the beans with the more concentrated stuff. And we see some blues, but then it eventually sort of turns purpley after the paper towel has dried a bit. I think that, you know, there is a possibility that we can shift the color. And rather than exploring this today, since I'm not expecting to get intense colors with no mordant anyway, I think that when we do this again, adding mordants into our project, we will absolutely vary the pH and see what we can see, because there's a chance that what is shifting here wouldn't really make a difference on the final yarn, but it also could. And so, oh, that's just fun. After 30 minutes, we are nice and hot, and I just reduced the temperature. And it does look like I see the superwash yarns taking on some color, and I'm curious. Okay, if I pour water on it, I think everything is absorbing some amount of color. Interesting and exciting. Oh, this is great. I'm glad that we're getting something. I'm always afraid when I do this that there'll be no color at all. I'm gonna go and leave this just on low heat. I think I'm gonna go for a full hour, and then I'll come back. All right, after an hour, we're still on some really low heat, but let's try pouring some water on top and see what happens. So it looks like, you know, the color does look darker than I think it'll be when the yarn is dry. The superwash yarn has a lot of pigment in it. Something, maybe the cotton or synthetics, does not have very much color in it, but the 100% wool is not bare, and there is something to it. You know, it's not turning off white in the way that it did at the beginning. There is some hue to it. I am now going to turn off the heat and leave everything in the pot to cool off. This will give it a little more time to absorb some color. Not that I expect the dye bath to clear in this case. There's probably a lot of pigment in there that isn't something that might bind to yarn, but I do want to give it a little more time to have the fiber in contact with the dye. You know how I said I was only going to wait a couple of hours? Well, it's been 2 days. So after the heating, this sat in the pot for 2 days. We're not going to know how much of a difference this made for the overall color, but let's see what we were able to achieve when we wash it. So I'm expecting that there will be a lot of bleeding. I think that there's like just extra pigment and color around, but this is our wool yarn, and yeah, you can see that there's a lot of color coming out already. So I'm going to go ahead and swap the water before even adding the mini skeins to the rinse down. Before washing, here are the mini skeins. Everything looks like it has some amount of color in it right now, even if it's just like a tiny amount of color. But I'm expecting that some of these might have a tiny bit of stain but we'll sort of go back more to their color. But there's a lot of pigment in here. But again, this could be pigment that won't bind to the yarn. All things considered, that's not a lot of bleeding. Okay, it does look like the color in the wool yarn will be a little paler than it's looking right now, but man, I am really, really impressed by this deep, deep color in the superwash. And even, what's this, I think the cotton is looking sort of purpley, sort of gray right now. We'll see what remains. We're going to add, I've got here some clear dish soap. I like using clear dish soap just because it doesn't change the color of the water. And so therefore, as things bleed, as we're washing, we know that the color we're seeing is coming out of our fibers versus coming out of, the color is coming out of the fibers versus being a result of the soap. But yeah, I'm going to keep washing. I'll come back if there's anything notable, but I would say we successfully dyed yarn with black beans. ChemKnits patrons, thank you so much for not only your support, but encouraging me to go outside of my comfort zone and sort of bump things up in the queue that I've wanted to try, but kept putting off for one reason or another. I never would have thought to have dyed yarn with black beans if not for receiving this question and comments from viewers like you. I would like to take this time to give a huge shout out to Christine Duquette, Ada Lai, Karen Siegel, and the other fiber patrons. Thank you so much for all of your support. Patreon is a platform that connects fans with the creators that they really enjoy. And in subscribing on Patreon, you can get some really, really cool perks and support ChemKnits at the same time. I think that one of my favorite things is that patrons will vote every month for the topic of the next month's Dyepot PS episode. And so your voice really does matter. And even the things that don't come in first in these polls still end up sort of coming up my queue sooner than otherwise they might. Other benefits that patrons get include early access to a new yarn dyeing video every month, behind the scenes sneak peeks, an exclusive newsletter, and more. You can find a link both in the video description and the iCard, and you should check it out. So let's look at this amazing yarn that we dyed with black beans and no Mordant. I've talked about this throughout the whole video, but I know it might be weird or strange that I'm not adding the Mordant straight away. But I am truly curious to see, can you get anything without the Mordant? Just like, can you get any food coloring to strike yarn with no vinegar? What is required to dye these yarns? And there is no question whatsoever that we absorbed a lot of color into our wool-based yarns. I raised some questions about Mordants earlier in this video, and I want to make one thing extremely clear. I personally, and I recommend, when you are using Mordants with your fibers, doing it outside, using dedicated dye equipment. I think it's better to always err on the side of caution. I know that in general, alum is safer to use, less toxic than some of the other heavy metals that you can use to help you dye yarn. But either way, it's still better to err on the side of caution. But I would still love, if you guys have any resources, I would still please send them to me, because Mordants is a whole new category and something that I really don't have any experience with yet. Of our mini skeins, the superwash yarns, the stroll fingering, and the swish DK absorbed the most color. And these are sort of a grayish brown. In terms of depth of color, the wool of the Andes, which is the same we did in this full skein, this 100% non-superwash wool, is again, sort of a brown gray. In different lights, it looks more gray. In other lights, it looks a little warmer and more like a brown. But I love this color. The 100% cotton looks a little blue. It's definitely a much cooler tone than what we see in the wool of the Andes. And then as for our synthetics, the 100% polyester and the 100% acrylic, those definitely are stained. I think if I went and I pulled the bare yarns that were more of a pure white, you would see that they did take up something. But again, I think that this is stained versus dyed. And I think that, you know, you could leave this in and you could boil it for a week and you would not see any more color. You would just sort of see a little, not that it's dingy because the colors are still pretty, but, you know, it's stained, not overdyed. Rebecca, these colors are fun and all, but what about those blues you were talking about? Well, as someone with a background in natural product extraction and biosynthesis and all kinds of stuff like that, it's possible that there's a few different things that could be happening here and that I did different versus some other people that were able to get some blues when dyeing yarn with black beans. One big thing that I did differently from a lot of the other blog posts that I found was that I heated the yarn. It is possible that there are some impurities beyond these blue pigments and that with heat these were absorbing to the fiber as well. And potentially if you were to not heat the fiber, maybe over days at room temperature you could get these blue pigments to bind, not the other pigments, and therefore wash those away and give us a cooler tone overall. There clearly is a hint that there is something blue. We saw it on the paper towels, you know, we see it a little bit in this cotton maybe. So yeah, but my gut says right away, one thing I might try is not heating the colors. The second thing is the lack of mordant. When you add these metal ions and they complex with these colors, with these molecules that have these colors, you can shift the color. So that's a second thing. The third thing is the pH. We saw that these colors shift. We got something that looked very pink when we added acid and something that looked more green when we added a base. And by shifting the pH, maybe that's another way that we could have ended up with something that looked more blue than this gray brown kind of business that we have here. Another thing I want to address is that since the superwash yarns always take up the pigment so much better than all of these other yarns, why do I always do this on 100% wool versus going straight for the superwash? And ultimately, I think that the superwash treatment makes it easier for color to bind yarn. We've seen this over and over again. But even though what I'm doing today isn't necessarily historical, I do know that there is a historical component to using plants and other food type items to dye yarn. And I don't know, it's just superwash yarn isn't something that has existed as long as natural dyeing. And so honestly, that's a big reason why I tend to start with just the wool. But especially with these natural dyes, when I honestly don't know what the colored molecule is that we are binding to the yarn, and the fact that these colors could absorb differently to cotton versus wool, that's a big reason why I like to throw all these mini skeins in the pot, because, you know, like avocado was way more, like gave a much bigger impact on the cotton than the wool. And so it's hard to know until you try it. And so this way, if we see nothing happen across the board, then maybe we need to go and try something else. But the fact that without mordant, we got all of this pigment in the superwash, that's awesome. It's a little hard to see, but we did get some really nice, subtle tonal variation on our big 100 gram skein. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure that you are subscribed to the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel. I love to play around with different ways to add color to yarn, and I also like to film things when I try it for the first time. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, but I feel like every time, no matter what, we learn from the process, and I think that it can make all of us better dyers. If you have any suggestions on how I can improve this technique or other supermarket items that you would like to see me try to dye yarn with, please let me know in the comments. I seriously take all these suggestions and requests, I add them all to a list of ideas, and some of your questions result in some of my favorite projects ever. Thank you so much for watching.